Hello, I'm Matthew Hood, Vice President of Government Relations at Dartmouth Health. As a 501c3 organization, Dartmouth Health does not engage in election intervention activities, meaning we don't tell people whom to vote for, but we do invite all candidates for discussions so that we can learn where they stand on issues and have an opportunity to ask questions. I want to thank you for your engagement and remind you to vote on November 5th.
Hello, Dartmouth Health community, and welcome to the We Care, We Vote 2024 election discussion. We Care, We Vote is a nonpartisan voter education initiative sponsored by the Dartmouth Health Office of Government Relations to arm you with the information you need to cast your most precious vote next Tuesday. My name is John Kacavas. I'm the Chief Legal Officer and General Counsel for Dartmouth Health, and today I'm pleased to be joined by two longtime political observers in the state of New Hampshire. On my right, Scott Spradling of the Spradling Group. Scott, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
And on my left, Dean Spiliotes, a civics scholar at Southern New Hampshire University and frequent commenter on politics in New Hampshire and nationally. Dean, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here.
All right, guys, let's talk politics.
Let's do it.
Big race, obviously, is the presidential race, probably one of the most closely contested, if not the most closely contested race in the history of our country. You've got former President Trump, who's been running for this seat since he lost the election in 2020, and you've got Kamala Harris, who's been running for this seat, for this office for 4 months or so. How do you see it shaking out, Dean?
So I think by all accounts, it's a very tight race. Everybody I talk to on both sides is doom scrolling on their phones, looking for polling data that reinforces their particular hopes for the election. You know, it's interesting. I was having a conversation about this with my students recently. When I started doing this about 30 years ago, polling data was kind of like the referee. There were a couple of large, well-respected polling outfits, and everybody would, have the campaign and debate and argue, and then everybody would look at the polls to kind of get a sense of how things are going. What I've seen now is polling data has become part of the larger partisan discourse. The minute a poll goes up that favors President Trump, Democrats come in with all the reasons why the assumptions in the poll are wrong. Same thing when we see a poll that shows Kamala Harris with a lead, Republicans immediately jump in on social media with all the reasons why the poll should be discredited. So it makes it a very complicated information environment. It's obviously saturated. You can pretty much find whatever it is you want to find in terms of reinforcing your prior beliefs. So it makes it much harder to know what's really happening.
Yeah.
We've seen, Trump up by a few points nationally and in most of the swing states, and at the same time, a day later, it looks like Harris is up a few points nationally in the swing states. So it's very close. I tell friends and family who are constantly badgering me, people have started voting, and once people start voting, focus on turnout. And getting out the vote, not so much on what the polls say at a given moment.
Yeah, that's a great point, Dean.
Yeah.
I guess the question is, who's going to outperform? Who's going to overperform their polls and underperform their polls? What do you think, Scott?
So it's a tough call because right now what we have, to Dean's point, is a very, very close national election. Only a small handful of states that are most likely going to decide this thing. For a national race, there's probably, 5 states? You've got Pennsylvania, you've got Michigan, Wisconsin, arguably Georgia, arguably Arizona, a couple of others that we're watching. They're going to determine who's going to be president. And in terms of overperforming and underperforming, we have this ever shrinking number of undecided voters that are going to either break at the last second or decide not to vote. But this is a really important percentage of folks. And so where we are at right now in these closing days is the closing argument part of the campaign. Right. And I think as we've been watching this, let's not forget, this is a sprint of a presidential race because Kamala Harris has only been in this thing for a couple of months. So for those who are really hoping that Kamala Harris wins this thing, she has got to close the deal with voters and make that closing argument about what I'm going to do as your president. I think for Donald Trump, he has got to motivate his base to a high energy level that is, do or die. We are voting next Tuesday in big numbers and maybe close the deal on a few of those undecideds that are left in those closing states. But this is a coin flip election. It is that close out there.
Yeah.
And I would just add, it's a truism in American politics that presidential candidates always run as outsiders. That's what Americans like. That's how people vote. So Kamala Harris is running as an insurgent, as an outsider, even though she's the sitting vice president.
Right.
And then you fold in on top of that Donald Trump is in a sense an incumbent. He's been president. So people have knowledge of what his administration was like. So it's just a really unusual set of dynamics playing out. And, the swing states are very important. Scott mentioned 5. You could also throw in North Carolina and maybe Nevada as well. But we're really looking at basically 4 or 5 states that are they're gonna make the difference. So polling is very difficult. Whenever Republicans see polls that favor Democrats, they say, well, in 2016 and 2020, the polling undercounted the Trump vote. But in 2022, it undercounted the Democratic vote because everyone said, oh, it's going to be a red wave, and that didn't materialize. So the question is, how are pollsters adjusting to compensate for these under and over counting? And we don't really know who has it right yet.
Yeah, I think Scott made a great point about Kamala Harris needing to close the deal and make the final argument to the American people. Donald Trump, on the other hand, doesn't really need to do that. He's told us what he's going to do. Everybody knows what Donald Trump's going to do, right?
He's very well known.
What does Kamala need to do to close the deal?
So I think this is, and she may very well be doing this out on the stump because most of us are watching her performance through the prism of media coverage. So we're catching Vice President Harris through sound bites, not necessarily watching a wire-to-wire event. But with that said, for her, she needs to be in front of the American public, in my opinion, making the argument about what a presidential Harris campaign and then leadership structure and blueprint is going to look like. What are my priority items going to be? I am going to lead from the center. I am going to bring the 2 parties together. We're going to work on this in the Middle East. We're going to work on this with the economy. We're going to work on this with workforce housing. I think she needs to be able to reassure the public that she understands and is connected to the concerns that everyday people have right now in the campaign trail and right now in their everyday lives in order to help make
the challenge for her is that's right, and that's essentially a rhetorical challenge.
It is.
She's released many policy proposals. You can go on their website. You can go online. You can read all about housing. You can read all about childcare. So the policy proposals are there.
Yeah.
But to close the deal, you have to be able to rhetorically convince people that you can lead them.
Yeah.
You can lead them there. And she's got to do 2 things. She's got to target an economic message to the middle class, and then continue to use this sort of threat to democracy argument to drive turnout as well. And those are 2 big challenges for her.
Yeah. So speaking of policy, this is an issue that is of interest to our audience, but it hasn't really been driving. We were talking before we went on camera.
Yeah.
It hasn't really been driving this election, and that's healthcare. You heard Donald Trump in the debate say, I saved the ACA multiple times. First of all, I want to hear about the validity of that claim. But what's the difference on healthcare with these 2 candidates?
I mean, it is remarkable that the healthcare conversation has been, I think, boiled down to one moment in one debate where Donald Trump talked about having concepts of a plan. So it became a weird punchline in a topic that's really important to all Americans because affordable, accessible healthcare is an underpinning of all of our quality of life. But with that said, this issue is not driving voter conversations. It doesn't seem to be an issue that's on the priority list of what voters are thinking about today. So the question becomes, what do we have? And I think it is a reasonably clear-cut choice for voters between the 2 because one thing we do remember in the earliest days of Donald Trump being in office, one of the very first things he tried to do was to upend and eliminate the ACA. Now that he's taking credit for it, it seems a little bit bizarre, totally invalid claim. At the same time, he's now sort of crediting and trying to say that this is a decent plan, but I still want to make changes. The bottom line is Donald Trump has been very vague, intentionally vague about what his plans are. Vice President Harris has been very clear about what her plans are. So if you are a health care voter, it ends up being a pretty clear-cut choice between status quo of what we have in building on the ACA and unpredictable future with the same plan.
Republicans in Congress tried for the better part of a decade to repeal the ACA, and were unable to do it. And Trump came in and said he was going to do it as well. And you remember the famous John McCain thumbs down, which prevented him from repealing it.
You can
and
say John McCain saved the ACA.
You could say that. And Trump has spent many years now saying, well, he'll make it better, but we haven't really seen a plan yet. He's promised it at various moments. Democrats are really focused on things like lowering prescription drug costs, price of insulin they talk about a lot, branching off into addiction and mental health and all these other areas. And so, I think it's just interesting to me to see how controversial the ACA used to be.
Right. And
now it's kind of viewed as generally a good thing that can be tweaked, but not something that's going to be repealed anytime soon.
Yeah. You mentioned Congress. We've got probably 43 closely contested districts in the country that may tip the balance of power in the House to the Republicans or the Democrats. It's obviously a razor-thin margin for the Republicans right now. The Senate, a lot of Democrats up, and that is in danger of flipping. Give us a little bit of your perspective on the Congress.
Sure. I mean, Congress is very close, and the final disposition of the two chambers is going to have a big impact on either potential president's ability to get anything done. Right. In the House, I think you could go even a little further and say there are maybe 25 seats that are really in play, which is a remarkable thing in itself. And that gets back to gerrymandering, which we can talk about later. But there aren't that many seats that are in play. There are a number of seats in New York, New York, after the last census, Democrats control the legislature up there. Drew a map that was sort of overly favorable to Democrats. The courts had them redo it, and as a result of that, there were several seats that flipped Republican, even though Biden won those districts. So Democrats are really focused on getting those back. They don't need a lot of seats. So we may have a case where they take back the House by a narrow majority, 4 or 5 seats, and potentially lose the Senate. Over in the Senate, Joe Manchin's not running for re-election. That seat's going to go Republican. That puts you at 50-50. So at a minimum, you'd need for Democrats, you would need a Democratic vice president to split ties. John Tester out west is in trouble, potentially. Sherrod Brown in Ohio has a very challenging race. Bob Casey in Pennsylvania. Very popular Larry Hogan, former governor of Maryland, is running for the Senate in Maryland. Republicans could end up, 52, 53 seats, or it could end up a split. We don't know. In general, over the last month, a lot of the Senate Democratic candidates have been kind of a little bit outperforming Kamala Harris, which means they're actually pretty strong. But it doesn't mean they're going to win. And so there are these 2 or 3 seats that are, the Ohio seat, Tester in Montana, is it Montana?
Montana. Yep.
And losing that West Virginia seat that are very tough.
Yeah. You also want to watch Texas with Ted
Colin
Cruz.
Allred. It's close, but
it's close.
But you keep thinking in your back of your head, well, it's Texas.
Like it's
Cruz
Texas,
is going to pull it out.
Exactly. But
it is close.
It's an interesting state to watch.
It was a lot closer several months ago, and Cruz has started to create some distance. Talk to me, Scott, about divided government.
Sure.
And what that means. I mean, this is an era of divided government.
Yes.
When historians look back, right? Is it good? Is it bad?
I think it's very good. I think it's important for both parties to have some type of check and balance of power against one another in the legislature in order to essentially have to be able to say, listen, if you don't get your way and I don't get my way, nothing gets done. We have to work together. And I think one of the best examples of how well that can work against conventional wisdom of it working is this most recent legislative session in 2024 in the New Hampshire House, where the difference between 400 lawmakers was a small handful. Democrats on any given day actually would technically have the majority in the House because of absences, of which there were an average of like 2 to 3 dozen every session. So you never really knew who was going to be in charge. So it really, really emphasized the need to work through the challenges of the budget and the major issues of the day. And wouldn't you know, the Democratic and House majority leaders both did exactly that. We had one of the most peaceful budget cycles we've ever seen in this last 2-year span because Democrats and Republicans made the decision to be pragmatic and to work together to try to get to some kind of a compromise. I think that's the example. And I think we've seen more than once, especially in New Hampshire, and it's more frequent for Republicans than Democrats, so I'll just use them, not picking on them, but Republicans would have the governor's office, the House, and the Senate. And they weren't getting things done as well as you would think it would just be like the slip and slide approach to legislative activity, and it's not. And I think what ends up happening is you end up with a unique power struggle when the other party isn't even necessarily involved in the conversation. That is not good for the overall legislative talk.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you go to graduate school in political science. All new students read a little pamphlet written by E.E. Schatzsnyder in the late 1950s about the responsible party model. And the theory is that democracy is supposed to work as follows. You choose a president, you give a president a Congress of his party, you let the president pursue an agenda, and then at the next election, if you don't like the agenda, you can vote the individuals out. That's like, in theory, how it's supposed to work. The reality, as Scott is suggesting, is unified government, same party controlling both the legislature and the executive, doesn't typically work very well. At the national level, Dwight Eisenhower struggled with it, Jimmy Carter struggled with it, Bill Clinton struggled with it. A number of presidents have struggled with having actually opportunity to do things. And what happens is internal fissures in your own party open up.
Yeah.
And so you have all this intra-party warfare that just sort of derails everything. At least with divided government, you have a chance. It's difficult, but you do have a chance potentially because you're going to have to make some compromises. And at some point, as difficult as the two parties make it for each other in Congress, they know at some point voters are going to want something out of the Congress.
Yeah.
So they may not do a lot, but they will do something. But modern presidential history is full of presidents who said they were going to use unified government, and it ends up being a disaster.
Yeah. Yep. Well, let's talk about the governor's race in New Hampshire.
Okay.
How does the presidential race affect our gubernatorial race? We have Kelly Ayotte on the Republican side, former United States Senator. You have Joyce Craig on the Democratic side, former mayor of Manchester, in a very hotly contested race.
Yeah.
What do you see?
So what I've heard from my friends who are in the trenches on both sides of the aisle, number one, there's unanimous agreement that this is a very, very close race. This is a point either way, and we're in a dead sprint with them side by side. Secondly, if Kamala Harris surges, stays strong, does very well in New Hampshire, the argument ends up being that there's a little bit of a coattails effect, that could pull a few extra points for Joyce Craig, which would obviously be a difference maker. We're seeing a little bit of information that's a little bit more recent that maybe the gap is closing a little bit, but I think we don't have enough information yet to see if there's a Republican surge happening in these closing days, but we're paying attention. We're watching to see if that's possible. Obviously, if that happens, then this is better for Kelly Ayotte. The question is, where's the number? If you accept the idea that going into these final days, Kamala Harris is and has led in New Hampshire, and if you accept the premise that, okay, she's probably going to win this thing, but the question is by how much? What I've heard from friends that are like in the trenches at the Republican Governors Association, who are pumping dollars into New Hampshire to try to help Kelly win, they start getting concerned at anything above 5-point victory for Kamala Harris. Anything above 10-point and they feel like this thing's over, it's absolutely Joyce Craig. So that window of 5 to 10 is where they believe there's enough momentum for Kamala Harris with that margin of victory to pull Joyce across the finish line.
So coattails for Kamala. What do you think?
Yeah, the biggest impact of a presidential year on the governor's race is typically to make the governor's race disappear. Most of the time, the presidential race sucks up all the oxygen, and you don't hear as much about the governor's race as you might in other midterm years. This is a little unusual because there is so much. There's millions and millions of dollars being pumped into this race, so it's a much more high profile for a presidential year than we typically see. I think it's also closer than people expected. I think a lot of us going in thought, well, Kelly Ayotte's had statewide office twice, once confirmed, once elected. Everybody knows her. She's got a lot of money. She kind of fits the sort of New Hampshire. If you look at other states, governors are often like quite ideological. You look at a place like Texas is just one example. New Hampshire governors tend to be slightly right of center, slightly left of center. They typically win by building coalitions in the middle. That's what Chris Sununu did.
Absolutely.
That's what Maggie Hassan did. John Lynch's classic version of that.
Yeah.
And so it's a little bit different than other states. So going in, people thought, well, Ayotte really kind of fits that mold. And in fact, I saw she has an ad up now where she's basically promising to kind of continue the Chris Sununu legacy. So so even friends of mine who are Democrats are like, okay, well, if she wins, it's not going to be the worst thing in the world because she's kind of centrist in comparison to like some of these other governors. Whether that's true or not, we'll find out, but that's kind of how they rationalize it. So I think it's closer than people expected. Joyce Craig, they've been relentless on reproductive rights, on kind of corporate cronyism, and those sorts of arguments. I think the biggest, so I think it's close. I think Scott's absolutely right. How Harris does will have some sort of an impact on that race. Although we do see circumstances like if you look at the midterm that we just had in 2022, Sununu won a huge landslide, and all the Democrats were reelected to Congress.
Yeah.
So we're a little unusual. A lot of people like that.
Yeah.
And
And the governor's race is often decided like that.
Yeah.
Right? It is its own island of in the world of the ballot for New Hampshire. The governor's race is just its own world.
Yeah.
So it makes it a little bit less predictable.
But like how, in terms of policy, to me, it feels like a very traditional Republican versus Democrat. Democrats are going to use the instruments of state government, funding, budgeting, legislating to tackle a variety of issues: education, healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. Republicans, Kelly Ayotte, well, what they're going to do is create sort of the proper revenue conditions, the proper tax policy to allow business to incentivize business. So it's a very traditional kind of competing notions of how you use fiscal policy in the state.
Yeah, and I think it's really been narrowed down in this race, especially based on the way the ads are coming at us relentlessly and the campaign signs and the visits themselves. This is a choice between Joyce Craig wanting you to look at Kelly Ayotte and say, you can't trust her, and don't forget about the choice abortion issue. Kelly Ayotte looking at Joyce Craig and saying, look at what she did in Manchester. This should be your barometer for grading her ability to lead. And she's going to raise your taxes. And we're going to have some real budget challenges because she's in charge. That is the sort of overly narrow focus now of what these two are saying.
They're basically debating whether or not they're going to sunset the interest and dividends tax, right?
Yep.
That's, and I think what Craig Ayotte is saying that if Craig does that, that'll be $160 million increase.
That's right.
So that's the kind of debate we're having. That's a very traditional fiscal debate between the two parties.
It is, but this year, it seems to me the defining difference is the reproductive rights.
That is like
debate.
a layer on top
That's
of it.
it,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
And you've got Kelly Ayotte, who supported the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade. You've got Joyce Craig and all that outside money and all those outside groups supporting her in support of a woman's reproductive choice. So that to me seems to be the issue on this, which this one breaks.
Talking to some Republican strategists recently, they've said that their understanding was that Ayotte was told repeatedly, do not waver from the current New Hampshire position on reproductive choice. The current way abortion is handled in the state, because if you show any kind of like leaning a little bit more conservatively or hem and haw about a national ban again, that's going to really hurt you. And it's been a challenging issue for her.
It's been a challenging issue for Republicans ever since Roe was essentially kicked back to the states.
Right.
And one of the fallouts of this conversation, which is something that is just very striking to me, is that especially among women candidates running for major office, we are now seeing deeply personal stories being told by our women political leaders about their own personal choices and decisions and path. And we're learning things about Joyce Craig and Kelly Ayotte and Stephanie Shaheen, and Maggie Goodlander. I mean, we're seeing these stories. My heart kind of goes out because I see that as an unintended consequence of a conversation that is so deeply important to so many families, so many people, obviously so many women. But it's almost like it has triggered a series of almost confessional moments in this campaign of, this was my path. I have to tell you what I've had to deal with as part of the conversation. And I find that to be unfortunate. It's unfortunate that women are having to tell this level of detail of their own story in order to explain their position on an issue that's so deeply personal. It's just an unfortunate side effect.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest challenges is there's real disagreement within the Republican Party about the path forward. So there are some folks who say, well, it should be a state-decided issue, and they're happy with that. That may mean that abortion is protected in the state constitution after some kind of a referendum, and others who think that's better than Roe, but given their druthers would prefer some sort of national ban. And that's been a real I mean, I have some former students who were very active in the Right to Life movement, and they're like in a different place than kind of the center of the Republican Party, what they want out of the federal government. So there's that constant clash between the different factions within the Republican Party.
Right. So let's return. We touched on it. Let's return to the New Hampshire legislature for a moment, because it's the governor who leads on policy, but it's the legislature who enacts it. And so when we talk about abortion rights and health care and other policy, do you see more of the same in New Hampshire? We're going to be a really closely divided House and a Senate that remains 14-10, something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think based on ground game, based on what Democrats are sort of saying to folks like us when they're talking about what they're seeing out there in the trenches, I think New Hampshire Democrats right now are feeling optimistic, hopeful, and confident that they can take back the New Hampshire House. I mean, remember, it's not like you're having to go after 50 races and flip. This is almost a 200-200 split right now as it is. So you're just looking for a handful. I think they feel, from recruitment to ground game to get out the vote efforts, they feel very good about taking over the majority and installing essentially Matt Wilhelm as the Speaker of the House. So they're very confident. What I'm hearing in the New Hampshire Senate is a slightly different conversation, where the conventional wisdom seems to be Republicans are going to stay in charge. Currently 14-10 to your point, John. The Senate District 12 race, which is Nashua, which is Kevin Avard, that is always a race that fluctuates in presidential election years, because that district sees a surge of Democrats every 4 years. So there's some questions about whether Kevin Avard survives that, and if he doesn't, there's your 13-11. And then there's focus on a few different Senate districts. The North Country Senate 1. Jeb Bradley, who our Senate president is leaving, which is sort of the Lakes Region East, Senate 3. Senate 7 is a race that people are watching, which is Dan Ennis. So there are a few that, much like the U.S. Senate, it's super close. Not sure exactly what's going to happen. I think as the dust settles, what I think people can possibly be prepared for is Dems run the House, Republicans have the Senate, and we'll see who's got the corner office, but they got to deal with the divided state House.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, and particularly in New Hampshire, or any place where you're talking about a very large state House of Representatives, you're going to have a lot of fluctuations. You know, people are voting in multi-candidate districts. They may not even know who the people are. They know what party they belong to typically, but voters may not be really familiar. And so other dynamics that drive party turnout in a given election really can have an influence, and so it could very easily flip. And then the dirty little secret about this House of Representatives here in New Hampshire is about 10% of the representatives are absent on any given day. So if you have so what happens legislatively is completely held hostage by whether or not people show up.
Right. Attendance. Democracy depends on attendance, right? You got to show up.
We saw it.
Right?
We saw it happen this past year.
Yeah. Well, in a stark contrast, we sit here on the Connecticut River across from Vermont. Vermont is not like New Hampshire in the sense of having divided government. Vermont has supermajorities of Democratic supermajority in the legislature. You've got a very moderate governor. You've got Bernie Sanders up for re-election, and everybody knows about Bernie. And you've got the sole House representative, a Democrat in Vermont, up for re-election. What accounts for the difference between New Hampshire and Vermont? We're demographically the same. We're older. We're graying. We're our populations are dwindling, except in southern New Hampshire. What's the difference?
It's a unique sort of cultural exercise where you've got two states that looked upside down mirror images of one another, and yet so very completely different. New Hampshire has been, for a number of years, a bit of a battleground purple state, whether it's the presidential elections or the race for governor, where we've got a lot of the pendulum swinging back and forth for control by both parties, and you don't see that in Vermont. There is a just far more culturally deeply embedded sense of what the priorities are in the state of Vermont that are very reflective of the progressive Democratic base. That is how these men and women and folks want to live in the state of Vermont. So I think you're seeing far less shifting. And Governor Phil Scott's a really good example as well, that he is, in any other state, he's not going to be a Republican. He'd be a Democrat. And yet he's popular. He's accessible. He is a governor of Vermont. In many ways, we've watched successful governors in New Hampshire be men and women of the people, where they are accessible. They are they're out in the field. They're cutting the ribbons and being a part of the different events and are almost an everyday part of the conversations of policies and decisions in Vermont. And it keeps a very tight link.
Yep.
It's also the case that in a state where you don't have a contested civic culture like we do here in New Hampshire,
Yeah.
where things don't fluctuate, it's people self-select. So,
Right.
you're moving up here to work at Dartmouth or at the hospital or in Centera, depending on where you're coming from and kind of what your preferences are, you may choose. I know people up here who went through that very same exercise. Do I want to live in New York? Do I want to live in New Hampshire? They're very different civic cultures. I mean, there is some blending, like right here, like Hanover, Lebanon, Norwich, those kind of White River Junction. But more broadly, the states are just very different political cultures, and that's sort of self-reinforcing.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
no doubt.
All right. Let's turn to our congressional races in New Hampshire.
Okay.
First congressional district, you've got three-term incumbent Chris Pappas, who's beaten back a couple of Trumpers, people who are strong advocates, vocal advocates of Donald Trump, and back on the Trump campaign in Caroline Leavitt and Matt Mowers. This year, he's got a less Trumpier candidate, in the words of Dean Spiliotes.
That's right.
Russ Prescott.
Russ Prescott, yep.
What about that race?
Who, as I noted, the Republican National Congressional Committee named Russell Prescott a young gun. They have this young gun program.
Did they really?
Yeah, I think he's like 63 or 64, but he's officially a young gun.
So I'm a young gun now.
Yeah,
It made me very happy.
Congratulations.
A
I'm
young
feeling
gun,
good
right?
about
Me too.
this.
So so I thought that was interesting. I'm just teasing him a little bit, but he's a long-time New Hampshire Politico. People know him from his, other elected positions in the state.
Yeah.
Chris Pappas is just a very tenacious politician. He is that sort of classic kind of slightly left of center New England politician. Yeah. He's very quick to point out where he differs from the Biden administration. I talk to people in the Manchester area all the time who vote Republican, and they're like, well, I'm going to vote for Chris Sununu, and I'm going to vote for Republican state races, but I'm going to vote for Chris Pappas.
Yeah.
And that's like his ace. That's going to give him a 4-5% margin every time, just as it has the last couple of times. What's so interesting to me, and we were just talking about in my class last week about redistricting, after the 2020 census, remember the state legislature tried to redraw Pappas's district, thinking, well, CD2 is now so Democratic.
Yeah.
Let's make CD1 more Republican, and we'll each have one. And they tried to move like Portsmouth and UNH into CD2 to get the Democrats out of the thing, and it didn't work. And Sununu didn't support it, and I think there was court decision as well.
Agreed.
So I think Pappas is Prescott's certainly not a Trumpy fellow. He is a young gun, so he'll get some money apparently. But I still think Pappas will be very difficult to beat. Second CD, I mean, if you follow Maggie Goodlander's campaign, the amount of money and organization she has, you would think it's a Senate race rather than a House race. I mean,
agree.
Really well-funded, well-organized. Lily Tong Williams, who's been around for a while in politics, both here and I think Colorado.
Yep.
It's just largely invisible. I think the Republican National Campaign Committee has just decided that that's not going to happen. They're not going to spend any resources on that.
I agree. Yeah. And I think in watching that second CD, which is really important to the backyard here in this part of the state of New Hampshire, Lily Tong Williams she came to New Hampshire as part of Craig Benson's Free State experience.
That's right.
So her politics has been consistent throughout.
She was a libertarian for a while.
She ran as a libertarian for Senate.
And so she's not well known outside of the political circles of folks like us who watch these things and remember her from being on the ballot. So being a relative unknown in a district that has consistently historically leaned as favorable to a Democratic candidate, this makes it probably the easiest prediction for New Hampshire major races on the ballot that Maggie Goodlander is going to be elected. And it's a really interesting and unique moment in time because she was not the chosen one by Annie Custer,
We've talked about
who was
this,
trying
Scott.
to hand
We've
this off,
had a
right?
lot of conversations
Yeah.
about this.
So there is an immediate distasteful backlash that happens among voters and the activists when an incumbent tries to hand his or her seat to someone else.
It just did not go well.
Just did not go well. And Maggie has run a very good race. She obviously has very impressive ties to D.C. And unlike other Dems and Republicans who have come in to run for Congress that could be nailed with a carpetbagger kind of an argument. And I recognize, born and raised in Nashua, I'm not trying to offend the Maggie Goodlander world out there. But we've seen this act before, and Maggie has been by far the most successful in making the personal connection necessary to put the carpetbagger stuff to the side and not have anybody really examine how much you've done in New Hampshire. Just tell us what you're going to do. And she's done it very well.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of us thought that actually Becky Whitley was going to be the alternative to Colin.
State Senator Becky
State
Whitley.
Senator, yes. And I think it's something she was very interested in. And then I remember reading articles about Maggie Goodlander, who hasn't lived here in a long time, is thinking about running, and a lot of us thought, well, it's probably kind of a little late.
Yeah,
but
I mean, I immediately thought of Morris Sullivan.
Exactly.
That's what I was sort of expecting. Like, great resume, but you're not from here. What is this going to look like? And Maggie was
spend a little time
completely
first
different.
and then run.
Yes. Yep.
What do you think about the first CD?
So I totally agree with Dean. I think that Chris Pappas has proven to be a bipartisan, consensus-building member of Congress, and he, to me, is the poster child of that sense of, oh, I hate Congress, but I like my congressman.
Yeah.
That is a little bit of that vibe that we have around Chris Pappas. And I think those relationships that he has are authentic on both sides of the aisle. I completely agree with Dean.
And,
I look in places like Bedford, where he scores really well in a Republican bedroom community right outside of Manchester. That, to me, is
ads that try to paint him as an ideologue, they just fall flat.
They fall flat.
And you know something, the thing about Chris is he's a little bit of an aw shucks kind of a guy. He's not an in-your-face politician. He's not loud. He's an authentic, good guy.
A Harvard-educated aw shucks guy.
Right, exactly. If there is such a thing, he figured out how to be that.
He did.
He's just a good guy. And you know, Russ Prescott is also a really good man. He's an engineer. He's very kind. He's not
at all. Been a civil race.
It has been a very civil
race.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so it's two gentlemen who serve together on the executive council and know one another.
Right.
But I think the Prescott nice guy thing is not going to be enough to close the gap over Pappas's very real district-wide authentic connection and relationship with voters.
Yeah, it just doesn't seem to matter in New Hampshire who the governor is. We send Democrats to Congress. This delegation has been a Democratic delegation for over a decade.
It's been a while, really, since the
2012, when Frank Ginta was,
and then before that, Jeb Bradley.
Right, that's right.
And that sort of gets to a question I have that I want to wrap up our discussion with, and you mentioned it before, Dean, and that's gerrymandering.
Yeah.
Talk to me about gerrymandering in New Hampshire, and how does that make a difference in the composition of our federal delegation?
Well, I mean, just for folks who are watching, gerrymandering is a function of the census and the reapportionment process. So every 10 years, the Constitution requires that we have a national census to find out about our population. After that, congressional seats in the House are reapportioned by population trends. So states that have outflows of population lose seats. States that have inflows of population may gain a seat or two. And then the icing on the cake is drawing, sort of confirming, redrawing the legislative the boundaries of these congressional districts.
Who gets to do that?
Well, it depends. In about 2/3 of the states, 34, 35 states, the party that controls state government gets to do that, sort of the spoils of the election. And it's been Republicans here in New Hampshire now in 2010, because that was a big Republican year. And that was the Republican
Revolution. And in 2000 as well.
And the Tea Party, and in 2000 as well. So, and this last time too. So what ends up happening is there's this amazing, and I should say in the other states, it's either like a nonpartisan commission, or they'll have 8 Democrats and 8 Republicans appointed, or they'll use a panel of judges. But most states, it's the party that is in state legislature. And there's software that allows you to really draw these crazy districts on a house-by-house basis. And I've been showing my students some of the wildest looking gerrymandered house districts out there. In some states, it's a real problem. And the Supreme Court has said if you gerrymander based on civil rights, on ethnicity or race, that's unconstitutional. It's a civil right issue. You do it on party, they have said that's a state issue. So you have all these battles in state courts about these maps. New Hampshire, it's been kind of the same for as long as I've been here. This attempt this last time to kick Portsmouth and UNH and that whole area into CD2. I mean, I think we all I remember just sort of giggling when I saw what they were proposing, because it was so obvious, and I knew it wasn't going to fly. Yeah. So maybe a little less so here. I think the bigger issue are kind of long-term immigration, people coming into the state versus who's leaving. As places like the Upper Valley, Manchester become these sort of high-tech engineering, healthcare hubs, they bring in a lot of people from cities, a lot of people from graduate schools. They tend to lean a little more democratic in general. So I think over the last 20 years, the state itself is less and less. I mean, when I moved here over 30 years ago, it felt very Republican, and it's just moved away from that little by little over 30 years.
Yeah, I would agree with
Final
that.
thoughts on?
Yeah, no, I think for the congressional districts, I think the gerrymandering has been kept to a minimum, and I think everybody's behaving well in the sandbox. I think if you look at the lines drawn, however, in the New Hampshire Senate districts,
that's why
that's where it's a little strange when you start thinking about, like, you know, obviously you just think of maybe little circular pockets, right, of a Senate district that makes it up, and some of these districts look like somebody's lower small intestines. Like, what are these towns barely touch one another? How does anybody even cover all these towns?
Executive council is kind of like that
council
too.
is exactly the
That's
same
why
way
we keep
too.
getting 3-2 or 4-1.
Exactly.
Right.
So there's
That
no
is true.
doubt that the Republicans have been able to take good advantage of that situation, and we're seeing it most certainly in the council. And to this day, it's
I
one
think
of the
that's
reasons
fair.
why, even in this climate, flipping the Senate from Republican to Democratic majority would be a challenge.
Well, thank you, fellas. That was a lot of fun. It was informative. And I want to thank the Dartmouth Health community for listening in. We hope that this was informative for you. Remember, We Care, We Vote means that every vote counts. And this is a nonpartisan. We're not supporting any one candidate or any one campaign in this. This was for information purposes only. You got expert views here, so use the information and please cast your vote. Thank you.